So today we are talking about literary devices or figurative devices or poetic devices, whatever you choose to call them. They are going to be in your exams and you must understand them. So I am doing a video entitled Devices today. And this is particularly for those persons who are struggling with understanding devices. So I'm finally getting a chance to do this video. It's my first video officially for 2021. So, I have to start by telling you I wish you all the best. The cliche stuff. Wish you all the best for 2021. I hope all you aspire to be this year becomes a reality. I hope all you want for yourself be the least that you get. Yes, the good stuff. Remember, with everything you do, try to be persistent, try to be persevering, and you're going to attain anything you set out for yourself. I wish you guys all the very best. So today is the 30th day of January in the year 2021, and I am Jamain Hatton. This is my YouTube channel, The Recap. So let's go into today's recap of devices. What started out as me doing YouTube videos to help people who are doing English B has become an overwhelming success. And as that, I want to say thank you very much to persons here who are subscribed. I recently attained the achievement of 10,000 subscribers. In fact, currently it's 10,700 subscribers. That is really impressive. It means a great lot to me. Thank you all so very much. Go on, recommend this channel to someone who's writing the exams in 21. Recommend the channel to someone who's writing the exams in 22. Let them get a jump start on their preparation. Thank you though. Thank you very much. Comment more though. Comment so my channel can be recommended more here on YouTube and my content can be viewed more also. So thank you again and I look forward to working with you. Persons who have been asking about online classes, yes, I do have online classes. I can put my number in the description together with my email address and you can send me a message to find out more about those classes. Thank you very much for the overwhelming support. So I have included here a list of all the major devices that you would find in an English B exam or an English A exam. The list is not exhaustive. In saying that, I mean that it is not all the devices there that exist currently in the world, but these are the major ones, the essential ones that you must know before you head into an English B exam. So we will have alliteration coming down right to paradox and the exciting ones like pun, contrast, and so on. Right? So let's go into it. So probably one of the simplest devices you will actually learn about is alliteration. Alliteration is a repetition of consonant sounds. So whenever you see consonant sounds being repeated one after the other or one after a small pause, that will be an example of alliteration. I have an example here for you. It says a silent snake slittered through the sea. So silent snake slittered through C. So the repetition of that S sound, and that will be an example of alliteration. Because I'm targeting the persons who are doing English B mostly, I'll give you some examples from the poems that you would have studied. So bird shooting season, men make marriages with their guns. So men make macho men as well. So all that will be an example of alliteration. Mirror, we see, I swallow. So once there are at least two consonant songs, it's a repetition of consonant songs, and it's an example of alliteration. Assonance is probably the opposite of alliteration in the sense that this one here now is a repetition of vowel sounds. So when you have several vowel sounds coming one after the other, that will be an example of assonance. So assonance example, easy eyes of eagle. The easy eyes of the eagle watched eerily. That's just an example I made up. So the eagle eyes, right? That repetition of that E sound, that eh sound is an example of assonance. So whenever you have vowel sounds being repeated, the device you're looking at is assonance. And one of my favorite devices is imagery. And imagery is that technique that often appeals to the senses. So it can appeal to any of the five senses or all of the five senses. Once it appeals to a sense, the idea that the reader is getting is imagery. And people often think when they hear imagery, they only think about seeing. But that's not quite true. Imagery involves any of the five senses. So you can think about some word that affect or some word that relates to sight, taste, touch, hearing. All of that would be an example of imagery. Example from Dulce et Decorum Est. We see bent like old beggars, knock-kneed, coughing like hags. That's an example of imagery. Of course, there is a like there, which is going to give you simile, but you can see the image of somebody being old beggars. You can see the image of somebody coughing. You can see the image of somebody being knock-kneed, as in they're bent, right? So that will be an example of imagery. And then we have in This is the Dark Time I Love by Carter, red flowers bend their heads in awful sorrow. The fact that the flowers are red and they're bending heads and it's a sad sight, that will give you an example of an image, right? That will give you a picture of an image. Brown beetles crawl about. You can see the image of the brown beetles crawling, right? So that's an example as well of imagery. Now we have probably the easiest device to recognize. It's called Onomatopoeia, and it's really an imitation of a sound. So whenever a word is used in a poem, and that word or group of words generally show a sound that an object is going to make, that will be an example of onomatopoeia. So for example, in God's grandeur, we hear generations have trod, have trod, have trod. That there is a repetition of that trod, 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 but it is going to be onomatopoeia in the sense that when we hear the word trod, we can hear the sound that this is making. Like when soldiers are marching, yeah, so we're hearing that trod, 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 right? Good. Then mirror, we hear splash of the lake. Whenever we use the word splash, we can figure out what the sound is that we will create when we hear a splash, or we would get when we get a splash. Think about squeak as well, the door squeak. What else? I asked, when I was teaching this class last year, I had a student told me picheling. The window go picheling. So yeah, if you're a Guyanese, you probably would know what picheling is, but it's a sound when windows break, they keep that picheling sound. That's not a very good example, but yeah, so it's generally a sound that is created when an object or a word is mentioned. So the word is the same sound that the word is. So the word is making that sound. Squeak. We all get a distinct image of what squeak is when we read the word squeak. So that's what onomatopoeia is. It's giving you the sound that the word makes with the actual word. So we see repetition is probably one of the simplest devices to pick out in exams or in poems, and it's simply because it is a simple repeating of a word or a phrase. So whenever you see repetition, it is the same thing being mentioned again and again. In the example of God's grandeur, we see generations have trod, have trod, have trod. We are seeing a repetition of the word trod. Half trod, half trod, half trod. And that gives us the impression of emphasis. Whenever you see something is being repeated, it is repeated for emphasis, trying to show you how deeply important the thing that is being repeated actually is. In the poem Once Upon a Time, we see a repetition of the title Once Upon a Time. In Dreaming Black Boy, we see the black boy saying, I wish, I wish, I wish. All of those tells us how badly this character, this persona wanted this thing that he was dreaming of. You don't often see this one a lot, but it is there. Hyperbole, some people will say hyperbole, hyperbole. This is a device which employs exaggeration. So there's a gross exaggeration of something. I paid a fortune for this book. I haven't seen you in a million years. Those are all examples of hyperbole. And the fact that we cannot actually pay someone a fortune for a book, the fact that you weren't alive for a whole 100 years tells us how it's exaggerating, right? Good. So exaggeration, gross exaggeration is seen in hyperbole. So one of the high yield questions that will always appear in the exam will be for you to identify a simile. Now a simile is any comparison between two things using the word like or the word as. So it's a comparison that employs the use of like or as. So let's say in the example of the woman speaks to the man who has employed her son. We see she said she carried him like the poor carried hope. So it's one person being compared to someone who's poor, right? So we see a comparison there using the word like. And then we see in West Indies, USA, Ireland seemed like dice tossed on the casino's bays. So it's as though you're comparing the island to a dice, right? So that's a comparison. And once it uses the word like or the word as, it's going to be an example of simile. And here now, it's a very important one because students often don't understand this one. And let's try to understand it. Metaphor is just like the simile, but it's not using like or as. So it's a comparison between two things. We are saying that one thing is something else to make a comparison between two objects, but we are not actually using the word like or the word summary. Example, Don is a fisherman. The time of the day, Don is a fisherman. That's comparing day or the time of day to someone else who is a fisherman, right? So that's an example of a metaphor. In the poem An African Thunderstorm, we can see the pelting march of the storm. We're comparing the storm to a march or soldiers marching, right? So it'll be an example of a metaphor. So remember again, a metaphor is a comparison between two things without actually using the word like or without using the word as. But they're comparing one thing by saying that thing is something else. Then personification is a form of figurative language where there is human qualities given to anything that is non-human. It's not non-living, but it's non-human, right? So let's say the clouds are referred to as pregnant clouds, or the pregnant clouds danced over the sky or in the sky. The fact that the clouds are classified as pregnant is personification, is personifying. The fact that the clouds can dance is also personification. Whenever we're giving the qualities of human beings to anything that is not human, it will be an example of personification. For example, the sly fox walked through the forest. Sly is the quality of a human being where there is some amount of cognition, you're able to think and draw conclusions. A fox is a living thing, but it's not human. So it's going to be an example of personification. In the poems, the red flowers bend their heads. In the poem, This is the Dark Time I Love, we see red flowers bend their heads in awful sorrow. The fact that the flowers don't have heads because they're not humans, that red flower bending head would be an example of personification. A stone's throw, we see kisses of stone, or hail of kisses of stone. That will be an example of personification because they're saying that the stone has the ability to have kisses or to do kissing, right? So that will be an example of personification. So again, for repetition, personification is a device where a human quality is given to anything that is not human. So contrast is probably one of my favorite devices in the sense that contrast is a juxtaposition of two things. What does that mean? It simply means two things that are opposite to each other are placed alongside each other in an effort to compare or in an effort to show the differences between them. So think about examples black versus white and light versus darkness. I often use those as examples when I teach contrast. Because if you understand black versus white, you understand what contrast really is. On one side of a room, you might have total darkness. On the other side, you have white or you have light, right? That is an example of contrast, right? So when you see that, you understand almost immediately what contrast means. I have here a speech written by Martin Luther King when he said, I have a dream that one day the state of Mississippi, a state that is sweltering in injustice and sweltering in heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. For it to be transformed into a state of freedom and injustice, when it was oppressed and unjust, then that would be an example of contrast. The state is moving from where it was unjust or unjust and to where it's now free. All right, so that's an example of contrast being used. And then we have in the poem West Indies, USA, where we have the Dallas of the West Indies is shown from the plane when the plane is high on above the ground. So when the plane is high above the ground, the thing looks so nice, it looks so beautiful. When you actually go down, when you go down on the streets, you see galvanized doors, shanties, and so on. So you see as though when you get down on the actual ground, it's not as beautiful as it's made out to be. Right? So that's an example of contrast. Can you think of any other? Can you think of any other? Go ahead and post in the comment section any other examples of contrast. There are many, many more. But the main one I want to tell you about is black versus white. If your example can fit in black versus white, then it will be an example of contrast. In the poem South, this is giving you a bonus, in the poem South, there's also contrast seen. When the person moved away to these stony cities, it was nice and developed and fancy, but it was hostile. When the person was in the Caribbean area, the place was very friendly, it was relaxing, it was serene. And when they went away into these developed world, the thing appeared to be unfriendly and cold. Right, so that's an example of contrast. The idyllic beauty of island life versus that sense of being tucked away in developed worlds. So we have a pop quiz. The dogs kissed my forehead and waved goodbye. Now, dog has a paw. So it might appear as though the dog actually can wave goodbye, but waving and kissing are qualities of human beings, and when those qualities are given to things that are not human, that would be an example of personification. So the dog's kissing the forehead and waving goodbye would be an example of personification. Go ahead and tell me in the comment section what will her cold hugs be an example of. What device would that be? Her cold hugs. Her hugs are as cold as ice. As cold as ice, so you're comparing the hugs to ice. So what will that be an example of? And her husband hugged her heavily as he left. Her husband hugged her heavily as he left. So look at that. Her husband hugged her heavily as he left. So don't think that because you have the word as there, it's going to be an example of simile. No, it's not. The previous one will be an example of simile, but this one, you're seeing a repetition here of a consonant sound. So what would that be? Go ahead and tell me in the comment section. Then we have a device that we call the pun. Now the pun is a play on words when it's used to have fun with something, right? So it's where we use a word, and that word can be having two different meanings. So we say we are playing with words. For example, I fear that the fair lady will not accompany me to the fair. Now, every time I use the word fair, I am using the word with a different meaning, right? So that is what pun is. It's really a play on words. It's playing with your words, right? Good. So I fear I'm afraid that the fair lady, the woman who is light skinned, will not accompany me to the fair, which is the event or a fun day, right? Good. So with that, you will have a stone's throw is actually a stone's throw, which is a pun, right? So a pun in this sense is to tell us that a stone's throw can mean something who is literally throwing a stone, or it can mean that something is very close by. In the Caribbean here, we say something is a stone's throw away. It means we are very close to something, right? So the thing is not very far away, right? So that is example of the pun. Then there's another one which is very easy to actually recognize. It's called the rhetorical question. Now, the rhetorical question is used in order to make someone reflect, or the person is going to think a little bit about what you have said. And in using the rhetorical question, the writer is putting the person who's reading in a position to introspect. So they're talking about something, and that person is going to ponder upon it. I'll give you an example. This is a dark time, my love. Whose boot comes walking in the dark night time? So somebody, they're asking the question of who is walking in the dark night time, right? Whose boot of steel tramps down the slender grass? Another rhetorical question. But you should not confuse rhetorical questions from another device called hyperborea. Now, hyperborea is actually when you're using a rhetorical question, but you go on to answer that question. So really, it's that one I just mentioned is actually hyperborea, where you give a question and you give the answer to that question immediately after it. Students often confuse this, and it's not very difficult. So let me just go on to give you an example of the hyperborea, and hopefully you get an understanding of what I'm talking about. Is it any wonder that his students pass every year? It's not any wonder, really, why my students pass. I'm just a very good teacher. Yeah, so let's go on. Is it any wonder that his students pass every year? Of course not. He is a good teacher. That is an example of hyperborea, where the question is asked and an answer is given to that question after it, right? So it appears to be a rhetorical question, but if the person goes on to answer that question, that will be an example of hyperborea. This comes almost every year in the Cape Communication Studies exams, and students always put rhetorical question and they lose the mark because the question actually goes on to give an answer. So that will not be a rhetorical question anymore, but it will be hyperborea. Let's go again. Rhetorical question just simply asks a question and move on. The person does not answer the question. Hyperborea, question is asked, and immediately after that question, an answer can be seen from the writer relating to that question. So a question is asked, answer is given. Hyperborea. So irony is a device where you generally are going to present an opposing view by stating the opposite of it. So we are presenting one thing, but we actually mean something else. For example, if I look outside and it's raining today, raining cats and dogs, it appears to be a very, very terrible day in terms of bad weather, muddy shoes, and all of that. I see all of that happening and I say, wow, what a wonderful weather we're having. Or what a wonderful day we're having. That day will be an example of irony. I see it's raining, shoes muddy, clothes wet. Obviously not going to be a wonderful day. So me saying that will be an example of irony. In our poems, Woman Speaks to the Man Who's Employed Her Son, we see irony when the woman said, what father gives a man hot and exploding death when he asks for bread? So that's a question. That would be an example of a rhetorical question too, and then we also see it in the ironic sense, because a father is supposed to be a caring person, a person who loves and provides for his children. A father will not want to give a son hurt, would not want to give a son harm, right? So that would be an example of irony. So you can have one device being used with different names, right? So let me repeat that. You can have one device No, that's not going. Sorry. You can have one statement, and that statement can have multiple devices in it. Like this example here. That is actually a rhetorical question together with an ironic statement. Good. And then you have the poem, Once Upon a Time, Father asking the son to teach him. That's ironic because a father should be the one teaching the son and not the son teaching the father. There are many more examples of this in almost all the poems, but in this example here, I'm just going to talk about those two. So again, recapping, irony is when the opposite is stated. Simply that, opposite is stated, right? So one thing is stated, but the opposite is implied. And coming off of irony, we have sarcasm, where one thing is stated, but the opposite is implied, which is irony, and there's another twist to this with the intent to insulting someone or the intent of shaming someone. So whenever sarcasm is used, shaming is implied, or you want to insult or hurt someone. So let's say I am going to say, I look at your test results. You got 1 out of 100 for my test on poetic devices. And I say, wow, what a genius you are. 1 out of 100 clearly means that you're not a genius. And if I use that to tell you that you are a genius, I am being sarcastic with the intention to insult you. All right? I'm not being ironic. Ironic would be when I am just saying one thing but meaning the opposite. When I say that to insult, that is going to be an example of sarcasm, right? But some people do use irony and sarcasm interchangeably, but it should not be used interchangeably because it's two different devices. When you are being sarcastic, you are trying to insult someone. You're trying to shame someone. When you're being ironic, you just simply say the opposite, and the one thing is mentioned and the opposite is implied. Then we have oxymoron. Now, oxymoron or an oxymoronic statement is one where two opposite ideas are placed alongside each other. And the meaning of this can be actually found in the word oxymoron. Oxy means sharp and moron, of course, means dull. So oxymoron is an example of an oxymoron, where two contradictory things or two opposing things are placed alongside each other. So we have examples, cruel kindness and living death. I'm living through death, right? That's an example of oxymoron. In the constant image of your face, we see heart's treachery. Treachery means betrayal, some kind of cruelness, some kind of heartlessness. And then we see heart, which is supposed to be so loving and so kind, being placed alongside something so evil, right? So that's an example of oxymoron. In Dark Time, My Love by Martin Carter, we see Festival of Guns. A festival is supposed to be a good time, a happy time, a fun time, and then we see guns placed alongside that. So that would be an example of oxymoron. Carnival of Misery, oxymoron. And then we have paradox. This is quite similar to oxymoron, but in paradox, we have an entire sentence or a statement is being used as the device. So just now when we had oxymoron, we saw that it is just a word or two words that is hyphenated to give us a meaning. Paradox, on the other hand, is where the entire statement can be taken to mean two contradictory things being placed alongside each other. In this example, it's weird not to be weird. So in that entire sentence, we are seeing that somebody is saying it is weird to not be weird, right? So that's an example of paradox, where the entire sentence is used with two contradictory things alongside each other. So to wrap up our talk today on poetic devices, I'm going to give you two bonus: symbolism and allusion. Now, symbolism is a beautiful, beautiful device that uses one object to give a different meaning to something. For example, in the drama Tijon and His Brothers by Derek Walcott, brilliant book, brilliant story, we see that there are many devices, there are many objects that are used to give a bigger picture. For example, Tijon is one character in the book. Well, not Tijon, let's talk about Grosjean. Grosjean, the older brother, is a character in the book that is used to symbolize one set of people who rely only on their physical strength. Those slaves who rely on their physical strength. We see that the forest is a place in the drama that is used to symbolize the Caribbean society, the Caribbean, society, Caribbean way of life, right? So symbolism is where one thing is used to give a different meaning, to hinting to something else, to give a bigger picture to something, right? And then we have allusion, where something is alluding to something else, right? So you can have many examples of this. In the poem, The Woman Speaks to the Man Who Has Employed Her Son, we see examples of allusion there when they were talking about Judas Iscariot's mother, the thief on the left side of Jesus as he was being crucified. That's an example too of allusion, right? So allusion is where you're alluding to something. You are making a biblical allusion. Something is being used and you are referencing something else. You are referring to something else. You are alluding to something else in the sense of this thief being... So we have this thief alluding to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So they're making a biblical allusion in the sense that one thing that is being discussed now is alluding to the crucifixion of Christ. So that is what we call allusion, when one thing is alluding or referencing something else. So we have two words that we're going to close off with. Now you can have multiple choice questions in the exam, often asking you what is the tone or what is the mood, and you try to remember what I'm about to tell you here. Tone is a characteristic of the writer. How the writer feels as this thing was written, right? What is the tone of the writer, meaning how the writer feels when this was written. So T for tone, T is in writer. So tone is how the writer feels. Then we have mood. Now mood is how the writer makes me feel as I read this. So M for mood, M for me. So how the writer makes me feel after I read this thing would be the mood, right? So just remember that. Mood will be how I feel, and tone is how the writer felt. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this session was helpful.